Hello, and welcome to Keep the Channel Open, a podcast featuring conversations with artists, writers, and curators. My name is Mike Sakasagawa, and this is episode 69. Today's guest is Leah Umansky. Hey there, folks. So it's the 4th of July today, at least if you're listening the day this comes out, it's the 4th of July. In just a few minutes, you're going to hear a conversation in which Leah Umansky and I talk about, among other things, stories, and especially the kinds of stories that we tell ourselves. And that seems like a particularly fitting topic for today because the 4th of July is so much about story, you know? It's about the story that Americans tell ourselves about who we are, about what America is, and what it means. Now, stories are powerful things. Stories can comfort, they can unsettle, they can excuse, or they can indict. And stories are seductive. They get inside you, and they tell you about yourself, about what you're doing, and why. Don't underestimate the power of a story. Manifest Destiny was a story, and it was a story that changed the face of this continent. And depending on how you understand that story now, it's either a story of pioneers and growth, or it's a story of the displacement of indigenous people and atrocities against them. Slavery was a story too, or at least it was enabled by a story, you know, the story of racial supremacy, which that's a story that a lot of people still want to believe is a thing of the past, and that belief has consequences. Stories have consequences. The story of America is one that a lot of people, including me, have found inspiring and beautiful and deeply, deeply important. It's a story that, for example, my grandfather, my father's father, fought for and was wounded for in World War II when he fought in a segregated infantry unit, and while his family was imprisoned in a camp in the Arizona desert just because they happened to look like the enemy. And isn't that just like another story that we're hearing today? So this is the thing, right? The American story is one that's great, but it's not one that we as a people have ever collectively lived up to. You know, individually, sure, but as a whole, as a nation, we have always fallen short of the ideals in our story. So the question is, if that story is a worthwhile one, what can you and I and all of us do to make that story a true one? That's the question. And that's my challenge to you, the one listening to this right now. What are you going to do to make this a country that lives up to its own story? Well, there are a lot of ways to help, to get involved, lots of things big and small that you can do. What I want to ask you to do right now is make sure you're registered to vote. If you've never registered, or if you've moved, or maybe if you've changed your name, gotten married, or whatever, register or re-register to vote. You can go to vote.org right now, and they have resources to get you registered and check your registration status no matter which state you live in. I put a link in the show notes, so go ahead, pause the show, and go do that right now. I'll wait. And then make sure you get out there and vote in November. It matters. Do it. Election day is Tuesday, November 6th. Okay, now on to today's show. Today's guest is poet Leah Umansky. Leah is the author of 2 chapbooks and 2 full-length collections of poetry, most recently the full-length collection The Barbarous Century, which was published by Eyewear Publishing in March of this year. Her poems have appeared or are forthcoming in Poetry, The White Review, The Bennington Review, American Poetry Review, Thrush Literary Review, and The Brooklyn Rail, among others. And she describes herself as a Game of Thrones and Mad Men superfan, and some of her Game of Thrones poems have even been translated into Norwegian. Now, I recently read Leah's book, The Barbarous Century, and I just loved it. I found it to be this joyful, exuberant experience full of wonderfully playful language. And, you know, it just made me feel good. And, you know, there's the kind of art that makes you feel good by hiding or disguising the bad things by looking away. But then there's the kind that makes you feel good in spite of the darkness in the world, that doesn't shy away or fail to acknowledge it, but that refuses to succumb to it. And that's what The Barbarous Century is, I think. So, you know, I was pleased to talk with her about it. I put a link in the show notes to Leah's website where you can buy a copy of The Barbarous Century directly from her. I highly recommend it. Oh, and one more thing before we start. In the second segment, we talk about the HBO series Westworld with a heavy emphasis on the second half of the second season. If you want to avoid spoilers for any part of the show, I do recommend stopping after the first segment. If you'd like to join the conversation, you can use the hashtag #ChannelOpenPoetry to live tweet the episode. And now here's my conversation with Leah Umansky. So I was wondering if we could start with a poem.
Yeah. So I decided that I'm going to read the last poem in the book, in the Barbarous Century.
Perfect.
Actually. It feels very fitting for what's going on in the world.
Yeah.
The title is called Survival. My whole life I've been the speaker of my poems, but that isn't really true. My voice came late, sympathetic, like a witness or a victim. It was a rescuing impulse, that art. We were already groping at each other through the flower-sprayed fields of self-discovery. All across this body, I felt I was winning. I felt the harshness of promise conspire with the transformation of story, my story. We all have stories, like the way all states have fear. This is a feared state, but we must open the doors of our hearts and let the latches fall. All futures are uncertain. A brave new world is one where doom and sight are equivocal. Look again. This isn't fiction. We are living this. At times, the extraordinary overtakes me. A kiss, a new book, a moment of flattery, laughter, or a happy mistake. The dream, the scene of the past, and the present are all encounters like train travel. The moment passes through us before we register the scene. But I want to register this. I want to remember my hope and my heart. I want to remember the way time skips forward and away, like the stunning sight of bird wings beating, that stirred fascination, that flutter and art. Yes, I said art, and it is, even in this pacing of life we propel ourselves through. The wild joy is in the speaking. We must keep speaking. We are all in some way depressed, and the undepressed is in the imagining of desertion, the imagining of the next moment, the next day, the next year, like a rift opening. Keep looking. Manipulate that violating. Manipulate the whirl of your anger and meld it to what stirs you. In T.H. White's The Once and Future King, Merlin tells the young King Arthur, the wart, that he will someday face all the evil in the world. He says, learning will never fail you, and I feel that's good advice. We are all facing the darkness head on. Armor yourself in disruption and creation. That is the way this will end, in a forward slip into story, and taking the best parts of us into a future dawning with art and voice.
Thank you. Yeah, so it's funny. I was actually thinking a bunch about this poem, this exact poem, leading up to talking to you. I always kind of like to when I'm considering a collection of anything, whether it's poems or photographs or whatever, one of the things that I like to do is look at the first one and then look at the last one. Sequencing is always a big thing for photographers.
For sure, yeah.
And this poem, to me, it was really interesting because in some ways it felt to me like a really good encapsulation of the collection as a whole, sort of philosophically, I guess. Whereas sort of linguistically, it felt like more of a departure. And I thought it was just really interesting how, having this poem be sort of the thing that you leave us with. You know what I mean?
Yeah. I mean, that's kind of what I like about this poem is that it ends the book and that it does sort of leave the reader hopefully with a sense of hope, right? And a sense to sort of be optimistic and carry on. And I really like what you said about it sort of encapsulating the whole book because so much of the book has to do with story and different stories we tell ourselves, stories that surround us in pop culture and in, our families and in real life and in history and so forth. So ironically, it's also one of the poems in the book that was never published anywhere else. And so that kind of makes it one of my favorites too.
Yeah. And there's something, so like when I think about the line that has really popped out for me in this poem, for kind of obvious reasons, is look again, this isn't fiction. We are living this.
Yeah.
And yet, and there's something about that when I'm thinking about what we are living right now.
Yeah.
It's such a strange and disorienting thing to be looking at it and thinking about how this is so much weirder than anything I've ever read,
Right. Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
And there's a way in which I can certainly find myself tipping towards despair, but I feel like there's something about both this poem and the collection as a whole that really, sort of acknowledges that, but also this poem in particular almost reads like a manifesto about why you shouldn't do that,
Oh, I love that. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I feel like there's always two ways you can go, right? You could either keep your head high and carry on, or you could fall back into despair. And I mean, in this state that we're living in, I mean, all I'm doing now is really writing about my anger and my rage. And so this poem and a couple other poems in the book were sort of thrown in right before it went to print. And this is, so what you picked up on is the more political aspect of this poem. Mm-hmm. In a lot of ways, I kind of see it as a sister poem to Stranger Is in American Life, because that's also a pretty political poem. And they're both sort of about surviving and keeping hope. And one way for me is, through story, like I said before, any medium, TV, music, right? Mm-hmm. So
there's, let me see if I can find it. So there's a line in the poem For Reals where you say, I want to do, I want to make, and I want the making to do wondrous things. And that, to me, there's a way in which that itself is sort of the most powerful thing that we can do as, in order to fight that sort of urge to despair.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, and again, it goes back to creating and, in a way, I feel like us artists in any medium, are lucky that we have ways of expressing ourselves, right? Mm-hmm. Because tons of people are dealing with their fears and rage and anger and they can't get it out. I mean, I have so many friends that are writers that just can't write, for what they're feeling right now with the current political world. And it's hard.
It is. And one of the things that I thought about that was, my introduction to this book was actually, I don't know if that's quite the right way to say it, but sort of the first thing that when I opened the book was the inscription that you put in it. Mm-hmm. This little note you put where you just said, remember, the future doesn't need to be bleak. And I don't know, there's something about these poems that do that.
Thank you. That was sort of one of the missions of the book, whether I was conscious of it or not, was that, there's, again, a sense of hope and a sense of joy and a sense of wonder that we could hold on to, even though we might not be so happy. Mm-hmm. In simpler, the simplest way to say that.
Yeah. When I first, I've read through the whole collection a few times now, and the first time I read through it, I have to admit, I actually found the poems a little bit difficult. And part of this is just, me, that I sometimes have a little trouble with poetic language that is less straightforward.
Right.
But, I found myself looking for a key, if you will. Mm-hmm. And so then with that, when I had that in mind, it was interesting to me that in a couple of places, you almost put a tag on that. Say, this is here's a key for you. You know what I mean? There's, let me see. In This Is a Love Poem, you write sound is at the bottom of everything. Mm-hmm. At the end of For Reals, you write poetry is lonely times, but poetry is also language and also social. It's about personhood. I choose sound. It is a way to enter. It is a way.
Right.
And there was something about that really clicked for me that really opened up a lot of other things. The idea of sound being a key to the poems. And I was wondering if we could talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, and that kind of goes back to what you were saying about the first poem and the last poem. I mean, the last line of the first poem I heard, "The sparrows aging," is "I will sing of the heart." And there's so much of the heart in this book. And I mean, literally like the word heart. I think sound in many ways is where I write from a lot of times in terms of wordplay and repetition and melody and rhythm. And I mean, other than writing and reading, music's a really big part of my life. So I think it's kind of just always in my head. Not that I'm a musician, I'm not. But yeah, and the idea that, I mean, at least for me here in New York City, so much about being a writer for me is about community, right? And about supporting other writers in all different stages. And that's a big part of why I started my reading series here around 7 years ago. So yeah, I mean, because being a writer, being any kind of artist, I imagine, can be really lonely. And so that's kind of where that end of that, what was it, a real poem that you mentioned, that's where that comes from, right? That poetry is lonely times, but it's also social. And it's also about each other.
Yeah. There's something about, when you talk about having a reading series, that certainly makes it a more sort of tangibly connecting people in a social way. But I think also just even just hearing a poem out loud can really change the experience of the poem itself.
Absolutely.
Right?
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, in terms of song, I mean, there's also the whole element of like singing when you're happy, right? And sort of in the sense that like singing is almost kind of like an ode, right? You're praising something most of the time. And so in terms of language, which is where the sound is coming from, obviously, in this book, I mean, even in some of the pop culture poems, there's still sort of an ode to something, right?
One of the things I also thought was interesting when I was thinking about sound is how some of these poems, there's stuff in some of these poems that seems like it's actually very, very visual, like just what the poem looks like on the page.
Yeah.
Like the way that you use spaces and some of the ways that some of the poems kind of are all over the page and some of them are very tight. Some of them, like in turning over phrases, you have things that I'm not even really sure how you would say them out loud, like where you're like talking about things that you're typing, or there are little constructions here and there with double colons or things like that almost seem like impossible to say out loud. And I thought that was really interesting too.
That is interesting. Yeah. I mean, the colons a lot of time I use for emphasis or for pause. And there's definitely the visual element. You're totally right about that. But in turning over phrases, you have the line, "I touch type," and then there's 4 X's and brackets. And I sort of saw that as like typing, right? As like your finger typing on a key. I've actually only read that poem, I think, once before. And when I read it, I think I was being interviewed, and so it was sort of on the spot. And I just sort of put my finger in the air 4 times. So, sometimes you have to work on your feet.
Yeah. That poem too also really highlighted something for me about, so there's something I feel like very exuberant about the language in that poem especially, but in a lot of the poems, there's something that feels very almost like luxuriating in language. And in that poem, how the way that you sort of mix different types of emphases, like all caps and sometimes italics and other times, but also at times, and you do this throughout the thing where you sort of are flexing the language where like you're turning a lot of verbs into nouns and nouns into verbs and at times you're even just making words up, which
absolutely,
it struck me as almost kind of like it reminded me of like T.S. Eliot would do that, or even like Dr. Seuss would do that.
Yeah.
And like when you read a Dr. Seuss book and he's making up words, but they also feel so right, Right. And here you're like, you have a line in turning over phrases, and a word is now for swunk and for swinkled. Like that, it's just so happy.
Yeah, those aren't real words.
Right.
Well, I mean, that's also, I think, sort of the teacher in me, because I teach middle school, high school English, and there's so much that's sort of stigmatized in poetry. And so one of the things that I'm always telling students is that, poetry could be fun and you could play with it, and that there really aren't so many rules. And that's, I mean, I think what I'm drawn to in poetry is things like that. Like, yeah, for swunk and for swinkled are not real words. But it gives you a sort of essence, I think, in the poem.
Yeah. I mean, and I think like a lot of this sort of comes together. Like there's this sense in many of the poems, whether it's like I said, in how the lines in some of the poems are kind of all over the page, or the way that, like I say, you flex the language, where there's this sort of sense of wildness, or, I don't quite want to say chaos. That's not quite right. But do you know what I mean? Where it is really playful and sort of exuberant. And it made me happy in a way that I couldn't figure out why, almost,
I love that so much. That's good. Yeah. I mean, this is my second full-length collection, right? And my fourth book in total. And my first book, Domestic Uncertainties, my first full-length book, has a lot more white space. I mean, I'm really all over the page in so much of that book, where in this book, there's a lot more prose poems, which is interesting to me. I mean, it just sort of happened that way, but I love that made you happy.
Can you think of maybe why? Like, do you have a sense of why you were more attracted to prose poems at this point?
I mean, I've always sort of been attracted to them. There's quite a few prose poems in Domestic Uncertainties and in the chapbooks, but I don't know. I think it's because there's a lot of poems in here that are more narrative, that are more straightforward, which again kind of aligns itself with story. I mean, for a lot of friends of mine, for example, who are not poets and not writers, have said to me that this book was a lot easier for them to understand. Which kind of goes back to what you were saying earlier. But I don't know. It's probably just also personal that, I'm at a different point now in my life where I was when I was writing Domestic Uncertainties. In terms of, feeling confident as a writer, and in terms of being confident as a woman. I mean, Domestic Uncertainties is all about my marriage and my divorce. I sort of say it's a memoir of poetry in a way. And so there's a lot that I was searching for and coming to terms with, where now in 2018, things are much different.
One of the things you just said about, your friends saying that this book was easier to understand. What came to mind for me was we actually had a very brief conversation on Twitter a few weeks ago. And you said this thing that I've been sort of turning over in my head bunch since then. No, it's good. Where you said that, I think it was something like, that as a teacher and as a poet, that you like to say that poetry isn't about understanding a poem, but about how it makes you feel. Yeah,
100%.
Yeah. And I've been really turning that over in my mind a lot for, I think it was a couple 3 weeks ago that we had that conversation.
Yeah.
Because it's something that I personally kind of have a block about. I think that I tend to approach things intellectually first.
Right.
But I feel like one of the troubles that I had sort of immersing myself in this collection at first was that I kind of what I was just saying, I was having reactions emotionally to what I was reading, but I didn't really understand why. And it kind of, what that was sort of highlighting for me was that there are different ways of understanding things, and that, for me, I tend to be very analytical, and when I'm having a response to something, I really want to know and be able to articulate the reason. And I think I've gotten a little closer there, but I also kind of feel like there's a way in which you can understand something in a way that doesn't involve you being able to explain it.
Exactly.
Does that make sense?
100%. Yeah. I mean, I do stand by what I said. I believe that, and I say that quite often to people, especially to students. I think it could also be dependent on the kind of poem you're talking about. If you're reading something older, like William Blake, right? I mean, it's a different sort of thing. I mean, there's obviously scholars of Blake. And so you sort of, what you're looking for in terms of what the poem's about. I think in terms of contemporary poetry, for me, it's always been that a poem is successful if it makes you feel something. I mean, in terms of reading poetry, in terms of writing poetry, I know that a poem is strong, or a poem is successful when it makes me feel something.
Yeah.
There are certain poems in this book that really killed me in writing. I was devastated. Some of them are kind of heartbreaking.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, I get what you're saying though, that you're sort of making the point that there's a little bit of a disconnect between understanding something analytically and then understanding something emotionally.
Yeah. I mean, I
think that's okay.
Yeah. I guess it kind of has to be. Sometimes it kind of gets, I remember I was listening to another podcast a little while ago, and Kaveh Akbar was on it, and he was talking about how kind of the same thing where, like if you listen to a piece of music, you just have an immediate response to it, and you don't necessarily, you might be able to take it apart and say, like, if I built another song out of parts that did this, it might do something similar, but you still have this sort of instinctive reaction to it that goes beyond describing it.
100%. I mean, especially with music. I mean, Tori Amos is one of my favorite musicians ever, and there are tons of songs that I have no idea what the song's actually about, but I know what it means to me, and I know how it makes me feel.
Yeah. So I definitely didn't want to talk about this book and not talk about the middle section of it, because I feel like it's really important. Where you have the second section, the title of which is People Want Their Legends.
Yeah.
And that's also the title of the second to last poem in that section. And these are all poems that are inspired by or sort of responding to a couple of different pop culture items. And I found these really fascinating.
Thank you.
And I think what it was, so these poems are the ones that are about pop culture. You're referencing Game of Thrones and Mad Men. And that in itself was interesting enough, just as like responses to these things that we've all kind of seen, or at least most of us have seen. But the thing that really grabbed me was, there's a line in People Want Their Legends. There's a couple lines where one, you say, I want something to rally about. And then at the very end, you say, this is more powerful than myth. And what that got me to thinking about was sort of how myth and legend and religion, maybe how those, one thing that they do is connecting us to a tradition and connecting us to something bigger than ourselves. And it kind of feels like the way that you approach pop culture in this suggests that, like, maybe these shows are like our contemporary myths.
100%. I love that. Yeah. I mean, for me, that's, again, it goes back to the idea of story, right? And it goes back to the idea of, like, what inspires you, what motivates you, what gets you to move on despite sadness, despite rage, despite anger, or anything you're going through. I mean, and it's such a amazing thing that now, we're living through this golden age of television, and it's just like nothing has ever been before. And the writing is so inspiring and so relatable, and you have these larger than life characters that I feel like it's easy to align yourself with. And so for me, in a lot of ways, these characters and these TV shows, for sure, I mean, it sounds kind of lame to say it borders on religion, but there is that element of belief, right? That you're rooting for characters, you believe in what they're doing, you feel certain emotions that they feel. And so in a lot of these poems, the Mad Men poems and the Game of Thrones poems, even though I'm writing in response to a TV show, I'm in all those poems. I'm also writing about myself.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. It seems to me like, religion and myth, like one of the things that those things do is, in telling these stories, that they give us a way of understanding ourselves, and that they give us a way of understanding our place in the grand scheme of things.
Yeah.
And so it was really interesting to treat these things that, I mean, a lot of people would treat pop culture as just sort of a trifling thing, right?
And sometimes they do.
But, to treat them in the way that you have here as something, worthy of poetic attention, I don't know. There's something really, really kind of neat about that. I mean, it's not really a great word, neat, but.
No, but I get what you mean. Yeah. Well, I mean, to be honest, and I know I've said this many other times, but I really had no choice. I mean, when I started watching Game of Thrones, for example, I think season 1 was almost done. And I started watching it on HBO On Demand, and found myself for the first time ever, like, pausing and writing notes. And I had never done that in my life for any kind of TV show or movie. And so it was crazy when I sat down to write that week. And the first poem I wrote was I Want to Be Stark-like, because that title, that sentence, was a note on my phone. And I all of a sudden started writing Game of Thrones poems. So I really kind of had no choice, but I saw something in Ned Stark that inspired me.
Yeah. It's such an interesting thing, like these shows, especially these two, like the HBO shows in general, are such like a big part of, like, for like both of us spend a ton of time on Twitter. I know.
I love Twitter.
Yeah, I do too. Well, except for when it terrifies me, but
yeah, exactly.
But we like, just culturally, we spend so much time talking about these exact shows, and like everybody's got their take,
Yeah, for sure.
One of the things, like one of the lines that really jumped out at me at these this section of poems was in the poem is "The Times," where you say, "I thought I'd hate Dawn like everyone else, but I don't."
It's true.
Yeah.
True story. Well, I mean, the same thing. So when Mad Men started, I didn't start watching Mad Men until season 5 was already on TV. And like for years, people have been saying like, oh, you need to watch Mad Men. And I was like, yeah, no, like Don Draper, he doesn't look like someone I'm going to like. And I wasn't really that interested. And that was back when like Netflix was only like DVDs back in the good old days. And so, I started watching season 1 when I think season 5 had just ended on TV. And I just instantly fell in love with it. And I mean, that sentence is just true life. Like I really thought I was going to hate him, and I ended up connecting to him, and I mean, yes, pitying him because he's definitely flawed, but also falling in love with him in a way.
It's such a weird thing. Like, I feel like there's something in this about how we talk about things, and how, like, sometimes I'm not entirely sure how I feel about things because I don't know whether to trust my own instincts on something like, I mean, even if it's something as simple as just a television show, where you definitely have a lot of people saying, like, there are a lot of people who say, well, Dawn is trash, and if you like Dawn, you're trash.
I get it.
Which, like, I can certainly see the point, but also, like, sometimes it doesn't feel like there's a lot of room for people to form their own opinions.
Right.
Which is also one of the things that I like about these poems, that, like, that's what you're doing here, is like you're taking your very personal responses to these things and then like using them as a way of exploring yourself, and as a way, I don't know, there's just something about that feels sort of...
No, I get what you're saying. I mean, The Times is a long poem. It goes on for a couple pages, and I mean, it's very much about Dom, but it's also about Peggy, and I think the scene that I'm talking about, I think, is in season 5. It could be season 4, but I think it's season 5, where they have this moment in his office where he falls asleep on her lap, and it's like this beautifully tender scene. And it's like, for a split second, you see this other side of Don, and then you find out that Peggy's going to leave, and, the whole idea that she's trying to make something more of herself, and what's he going to do without her? But I mean, same with the Cersei poem. I mean, I remember writing the Cersei poem, and I couldn't believe I was writing a poem for Cersei because most people hate her guts, right? But when she does that walk of shame, it was like one of the most amazing things in the whole series. I mean, I think, at least for me, like, my heart really ached for her. I mean, here she was naked walking this walk of shame with that bell being rung above her. And, I saw her as a woman and as a mother in that one episode. And then, of course, after that, I hated her guts again. But, but yeah, I mean, in that one episode, I really saw her as like every woman. Yeah. And that's kind of where that poem came out of.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. That was hard to watch.
Yeah. I mean, it was intense.
Yeah. So I didn't want to leave this, we're going to probably move to the next segment soon, but I didn't want to leave this segment until we talked a little bit about the cover that, so I know you did the cover image yourself, right? That you do collage.
Yeah, I made the collage. I didn't do the font.
Right.
Yeah.
And I thought,
thank you.
Well, yeah, I think it's interesting. It's very visually interesting, but also what strikes me as really interesting about it is the idea of thinking about whether or not, or how something like collage and something like poetry can come together, or how the processes of those might inform one another. Do you think that making collages and making poems, that there's any similarity for you in how those things come about?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of overlay. I just don't know how conscious it is, again. I mean, I think it goes back to what you were saying about some of the poems and the white space, right? Because those are the more visual poems. And obviously collage is all visual. So yeah, I mean, there's definitely connections in the way that you're spacing things and you're laying things out. And I mean, when I made this cover, I knew the title of the book long before I made the cover. And so I knew The Barbarous Century was going to be both a book that was about despair, but also a book about hope and about the heart. And so I knew I wanted something that was kind of bleak, but also something that was sort of hopeful. And so I made the majority of it that blackish gray background, and I wanted to have something kind of bursting out that couldn't be controlled. And that's sort of where those roses come from. And these are just all things that I had cut out and stuck in a folder for years. I've always been that person that cuts things out. I mean, lots of people are, I guess. Mm-hmm. And lots of times it just sits in a folder and nothing happens. And then each time I've had a book come out, I've been lucky enough to make the cover. And so when I was putting this one together, originally it didn't have the three women on the front. It was just the roses and the black and the gray. And then I decided to put the women on it because I felt like it added a whole other layer of feminism to it. Mm-hmm. Though all three of those images came from magazines from the 50s, which I also think is interesting in terms of something like Mad Men, right? Yeah. But again, it's also about feeling, right? I knew that I wanted this sort of warmth to be busting out of it, and that's where the roses came from. Mm-hmm. And then when I saw the font that the art director did, Edwin Smith at Eyewear, I was just absolutely head over heels in love with it.
And, one of the things that I think about, with collage is how with collage it's different from some other visual art forms because you are taking things that are more or less found, right, and making something new out of it.
Exactly.
And there's something I felt like there was a connection there between that idea of finding and repurposing to what you're doing in some of these poems, especially the television ones.
Yeah. I mean, again, it goes back to story, right? I mean, I always sort of joke about this, but it's sort of true. And it's something that Jeanette Winterson says a lot, that every story is another story. Right? That there is sort of this idea that there's no original text because we're always telling the same story in different ways. And in a way that does kind of relate to collage and to art, like you were just saying. I mean, even that last poem, Survival, I mean, that T.H. White book, The Once and Future King, is one of my favorite books in the whole world. And so I never thought he would enter a poem, but he did because it when he says that to the ward in that book, it's all about how the ward is like this young kid that's going to become king. And he's like, I'm going to kill everything. It's going to be fantastic. Everything's going to be great. I'm going to capture all the evil in the world and defeat it. And T.H. White is sort of, not T.H. White, Merlin that says that is sort of thinking, well, you are going to try to do that and then you're going to get killed. But he can't say that to him because he knows he can see the future. And so that idea that we're all facing the darkness, we're all facing the evil, and what do we do to prepare ourselves? Well, one thing to do is to look to story.
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
It does. Story has been on my mind a lot the last couple of days.
Yeah. I mean, on the cover with the three women, there's one that's sort of dressed up in a cocktail dress, and there's one that you only have half her face in the leopard. And then the one next to her, it looks like she could be in some kind of a wedding dress. I'm not really sure. But what I loved about the first woman in the wedding dress is that it sort of reminded me of Wuthering Heights, the movie. And I mean, that book is my entire heart. So I kind of like that element of juxtaposition in it.
Yeah. I think there's a lot in this collage. So
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Yeah.
And I love that Eyewear reprints the cover on the inside in black and white. That's kind of cool.
Yeah.
I like that.
So why don't we take a quick little break and then we'll come back and do the second segment.
Okay.
So for the second segment, I always invite the guests to bring a topic of their own, and it can be whatever you'd like to talk about, whatever's on your mind. So what would you like to talk about today?
I think I want to talk about Westworld.
All right. I caught up the day before yesterday. Yeah, no, I'm all caught up. Should we put spoiler warnings on this?
Yeah. Spoiler alert.
Okay. All right. So where are you going?
I mean, I I liked what you said earlier about the idea that, especially in these HBO television shows, that they're sort of like larger than life and people are really connecting to things in a way that maybe they hadn't before. And what's interesting about Westworld, and season 2 is coming to an end on Sunday, is that for me at least, it represents to me so much of the current state we're living in the sense of what does it mean to be human? What does it mean to be humane? What's the difference between good and evil? So those elements are always sort of floating through my mind while I'm watching it. And also, again, what draws me, I think, to a lot of the TV shows that I'm interested in are these strong female characters. So there was an article, I think it was on Vice. It was back in maybe April that was talking about how Dolores is the new Khaleesi, which I found entertaining, but I don't think that they're that similar other than the long blonde hair.
Yeah.
But again, I mean, you have these two strong female characters that are sort of on a quest. They're on a search for something larger than themselves.
Yeah. For me, the character that I tend to find the most interesting is actually Maeve.
Oh yeah, I'm obsessed with Maeve.
Yeah. And she has that same, strong female character, sort of on a quest kind of thing. One of the things that I can never quite, and obviously this is just how the show is set up, is that they want you to keep guessing, but is to figure out like how much of what Dolores or Maeve or any of them, how much of what they're doing is their own free will and how much is just something that Ford has, wants them to do. It's such a weird question.
Right. It's so genius. It's amazing. I gave a reading on Monday at a reading series called Halfway There in Montclair, which was a lot of fun. And in my bio, I said, I usually say like Team Khaleesi, Team Maeve. And when I was introduced, one of the curators said, oh, but are you still Team Maeve? Like, do we even know what's happening with Maeve? Isn't she dying? And I said, well, I don't know. I mean, she's not dead yet. It looks like she's dying, but we don't know what's going to happen. And so I'm sort of always Team Maeve, but recently I've really become Team Bernard, and he's really struggling, right, with so much, internal conflict, but like literal internal conflict. Like Ford is in his code. Yeah. And it's just unreal. I mean, especially in this last episode last week where he tells Ford to get out of his head and he knows that he can't like escape him.
Yeah. This last episode was rough.
Oh my God. I can't. It's just, I don't know. I mean, the episode before that with Ghost Nation, I found to be one of the most beautiful things I've ever seen on television.
Yeah, that was really something. And also, it's something that this show, like the way that it portrays Native Americans has been, it's like very much drawn from like old Westerns and stuff like that, which is
exactly,
more as like a force of nature than as people. And then to have this, like, and especially to be juxtaposing sort of their search and quest and agency as compared to Maeve or Dolores or anybody else, like, that was really fascinating.
Yeah, and I just wrote a poem about that whole scene where Ford jumps into all of a sudden you see him, like, working with, I think it was, like, buffalo or horses. And, like, the lights are on, and Akacheta, is that his name? I think that's how you say his name. He all of a sudden came upon Ford, and then Ford put him into analysis. And like that whole scene was just so compelling to see that, the way that Ford has controlled basically everything.
Yeah.
And I wrote Ford his first poem the other day. I was shocked.
Wow.
based on that episode. And then I wrote William a poem the other day based on last week's episode. Yeah. Because again, like Cersei, older William, Ed Harris William, you sort of love to hate him because he's a bad guy. But then as the last couple episodes have shown you how flawed he is again, it's similar to Cersei, and it's also a bit similar to Don Draper, except I don't really see him as a villain in any way. But like the fact that he looked at his wife and he said to him that like she was right, that all this time he hasn't belonged to her world.
Yeah.
Was like this beautiful, scary moment where he hasn't even been present in the real world. He's been in love with Dolores for what, like 30 years?
Yeah. There's something about that, especially where that ends up with him, where he's so lost in the narrative of it that. For sure. So this is gonna get a little. Let's see where it goes. So, like, one of the things that I was thinking about recently is, so this year I'm on track to read more books than any year since I've been keeping track. I started keeping a reading journal in 2003, and
Wow.
so far I think I'm on my 49th book of the year right now.
I'm so jealous.
It almost feels a little pathological sometimes, but anyway, one of the things that I've been noticing is that, I've been reading more like back to back with like no break in between stories lately than I ever have before in my life. And it does this thing where, when you're reading a story, especially when you're reading, I feel, a narrative, not necessarily fiction, but a narrative, right? That when you're reading something like that, it's the emotions of it and the experience of it is so heightened. And then when you're done with it, there's this sort of almost weird, jarring sense of coming back to reality. Have you ever felt that before?
For sure, yeah.
And,
well, because you're leaving the story.
Yeah. And there's something about that, like where, since I've done that so many more times this year so far than I have in any other previous year, where I've been having that jolt more often, where there's something very seductive, right? About, especially about fiction. There's something kind of uncomfortable about that. And then when I was thinking about that with respect to this last episode, where now you've got William, who can't even tell the difference between what's real and what's not.
I know, my God.
There's something.
It's a good point.
Yeah.
I mean, it also goes back to obsession, right? And it goes back to what motivates you. And it goes back to the stories that you tell yourself.
Yeah.
I mean, and that could go for anybody. Like, I mean, the Barbarous Century is a book that's so much about being a single woman in the 21st century and sort of the stories that I tell myself to keep myself afloat, right? And so that kind of idea lends itself also to Westworld in the sense that, like, we don't really know what William's looking for, and he doesn't even really know very much anymore what he's looking for, but he's not going to let go of it.
Yeah.
Like you saw several times, especially in this season, where like he could have killed himself and he didn't.
Yeah.
I mean, when he kills his daughter, major spoiler alert, like that was crazy.
Yeah.
And that's when you really saw how much Ford is also in his head.
Yeah.
And the truth of the matter is, like, he's most likely not going to ever be able to live happily ever after with Dolores. Like, that ship has sailed.
Yeah.
So it's like, what's his end game? Like, what's he looking for?
Yeah. That thing you just said about the stories you tell yourself, that seems really relevant too. Like, there was the scene in this last episode where he's talking to his wife who he thinks is asleep.
Oh, it's amazing. Yeah.
And there was a line, he said something like, I tried to do good things in this world, to be generous, and that has to count for something.
Yeah. I wrote that down. That's sort of in the new poem I wrote.
I feel like there's this way, because there's so much truly horrific things going on in the world right now, in the world every day.
Yep.
And there's this sense, I feel like, where people tell themselves stories about themselves in order to make themselves more comfortable.
Yeah.
And those stories can be so seductive, and they make you feel good in such a way that they can allow you to do truly horrific things.
I mean, God forbid, but yeah. I mean, that's what's scary about him, right? I mean, now his whole family's gone.
Yeah.
I mean, even Dolores, I mean, that death at the end of last week's season was completely shocking. And, and this whole time she's thinking that, like, her and Teddy are going to enter into the real world and they're going to make it out. And it's interesting that, she got so carried up in her own story that she changes Teddy to be the man she needs him to be.
Yeah.
Which is interesting because Teddy's not even a real man to begin with, right? So she sort of slips into the role of Ford in a way and kind of demonizes Teddy, for lack of a better phrase. And at the end of that episode, when he realizes it, I mean, you just don't see that coming.
Yeah.
And it doesn't seem like she saw that coming either. And it's just, the same thing. Like, she's been telling herself this same story and it doesn't go the way she planned.
Yeah. I think that scene was one of the ones that to me was really, because so much of the show is this question about whether the hosts have agency or not. And I feel like there's an extension there to asking really whether any of us have agency or not.
100%, yeah.
But
which is another layer of brilliance in the show, is that so often it makes you think about yourself.
Yeah. That move that he makes at the end there, like the only choice that he can make, you got to kind of feel like that is a real feeling of agency there. Like that's a choice that he actually made. Yeah. That was heartbreaking, but
oh my God, yeah. Well, same with the Ghost Nation episode when Akasheta realizes that the only way that he could find his love is to kill himself so that he's taken out of the world and they like repair him. Mm-hmm. And then he gets taken out and then he goes into, I don't know what it is, like that basement or wherever where all the other robots are and he sees her. It was just absolutely heartbreaking.
Yeah.
And he realizes that she's not alive.
Yeah.
So it's interesting. I mean, in many ways, I feel like it's such a show about the heart and about love.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like even in last week's episode, when Ford is talking to Maeve and he says to her that she was always like a child to him because he didn't have any children. That was like such a touching moment too, because you still sort of don't know how, I mean, at least I don't know how I feel about Ford. I just still don't know if I think he's a good guy or a bad guy.
Yeah.
But in that moment, I felt sort of tender towards him.
Yeah, that episode, the last two episodes have really been swinging you back and forth.
Well, yeah, and that's kind of where I thought you were going before when you were talking about all these back-to-back books you were reading. Like, season 2 especially has been so, the way they jump around in time and the way that each narrative, because it's jumping through time, is like one after the other, and you really need to have like full brain capacity to understand what's going on and what time frame you're in.
Yeah.
Is kind of relates to what you were saying, which is fascinating.
That's true. I think so much of it with Anthony Hopkins too is, I mean, one, he's such a great actor, and they have just like an embarrassment of riches in terms of acting talent on that show. But with him, I sort of accidentally saw when I was a kid a few scenes from Silence of the Lambs that of him, and it wasn't even anything like gory or anything. It was like just one of the scenes where it's like a close up on his face and he's just talking. And that was legitimately one of the scariest things that I'd ever seen,
Yeah. It's scary.
Yeah. But then he also has had so many roles too, where he just has this real sort of seems like to have this profundity and wisdom and decency about him. Like the fact that he can do all of those things, that really does help with the ambiguity of this show.
Yeah, and I mean, it's funny because I remember seeing the posters for Westworld, like all over the city, like on the buses and in the subway stations. And it was just like that opening image of the circle and like the human form or like the mold or whatever of the human. Mm-hmm. And it looked so sci-fi. And I was like, oh, I don't even know if I'm going to want to watch that show. Because I like sci-fi, but I'm not like a diehard sci-fi fan or a fantasy fan for that matter. And so, then I read some article about Anthony Hopkins saying that it was one of the first times HBO proposed, a character to him for a show, and it was the only time he's ever said yes. I was like, wow. So that means it must be really good. And then when I started watching it, I mean, I just thought he was absolutely magnificent.
Yeah.
And yeah. I don't even know. I mean, and it's funny because all of season 2, like the beginning of season 2, like you don't know what the deal is with Ford, if he's alive or if he's dead, and you don't know how much of season 2 he's even going to be in. Like I remember feeling so sad after season 1, like, is that it? Like he only signed on for one season? That's unbelievable.
Yeah.
And obviously that's not the case. Like he's been in the last 3. But the scenes with him and Bernard, I mean, Jeffrey Wright is just so amazing.
Yeah.
I'm so excited for the finale. I don't know what's going to happen. It's going to be intense.
Yeah. Well, so there's one last question that I always ask everyone. We've actually kind of been talking about it this whole segment, but I'll ask it anyway. So the question I always ask is if there is a piece of art or literature or just general creativity that you've experienced recently that meant something to you. Obviously, Westworld is one of those things, but maybe we could pick something else too.
I've had a much different experience than you've had with reading. Like, this has been a really hard year for me in terms of reading. I haven't had a book I really loved in a long time. I just finished Melissa Broder's The Pisces, which was the first novel I think I've finished since, I don't know, maybe in the year. I just haven't had a book to love in a really long time. And it's a book that's about a love story between a woman and a merman. So it definitely has that sort of fantasy element to it. And I didn't really know how much I was going to like it. And it really resonated with me in terms of just like the whole notion of being on a quest for love and like finding out more about yourself. And so it's interesting that it has this merman fantasy element to it, but it's something that's really inspired me lately, and it's been surprising. Like, I didn't know if I was going to love that book, and I actually really, really enjoyed it.
Great. Well, thank you so much for talking with me. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Okay, so as I mentioned at the top of the show, you can purchase a copy of Leah's book, The Barbarous Century, directly from her via her website. And there's a link in the show notes for that. And if you're listening from Ireland or England, Leah has some readings coming up this month in Bantry, Cork, Belfast, Dublin, and London. And you can find all of the details on the events page on her website, and there's a link in the show notes for that as well. And that is our show. If you'd like to get in touch, you can find all of the show's contact and social media info in the show notes. If you'd like to support the show, a monthly pledge in any amount to our Patreon campaign is greatly appreciated, and you can find that at patreon.com/sakeriver. That's sake like the drink and river like river. Our theme music is by Poddington Bear. You can find more of his music available for licensing at soundofpicture.com. We'll be back on July 18th with a conversation with photographer and publisher Blue Mitchell, so be sure to come back for that. And until then, remember, keep the channel open.